The cold came into the house before Dustin fully understood it had arrived. She woke on the morning of January the 3rd, 1888, to a silence so complete it pressed against her eardrums like packed wool. And the first thing she did, before she reached for her boots, was press her bare palm flat against the interior wall beside her cot. The plaster was cool, not cold. Cool, the way a stone holds the memory of yesterday's sun even after the sun is gone. She lay there for a moment, palm against the wall, listening to the silence, and she thought about her father-in-law's voice, the particular dry rasp of it, the way he said things once and did not repeat himself because he assumed you were paying attention. She had been paying attention. Outside, the thermometer she had nailed to the doorframe post read 42 below zero. She had to light the lamp to see the number clearly, and she stood in the doorway in her coat with the lamp held low, and she read it twice, and then she pulled the door closed again with both hands and stood for a moment in the warmth her walls had kept. If you have found this channel and stayed this far, I am glad you are here. Stories like Dustin's deserve to be told slowly and in full. Stay with it. She was 31 years old. She had been a widow since September when the fever took her husband Clarence in the space of 8 days, and what he left behind was the homestead itself, 160 acres of high plains Montana grassland, a gray mule named Nettle, a store account at Harlan Voss's Mercantile that ran to $11.40, and the memory of everything his father had taught her about cold. The land sat 3 miles east of the town of Greele, which was less a town than a collection of ambitions arranged along a single unpaved street. There was Voss's store with its attached grain warehouse, a post office that shared a building with a saddler, a church that went half empty on warm Sundays, and a scatter of homestead claims running out in every direction like spokes from a wheel that had not yet decided its center. The people who worked those claims were practical, resourceful, and deeply certain of what they knew. That certainty was the kind that comes from surviving several hard winters in a row and concluding you have learned everything the land intends to teach you. Clarence had been sick through most of the previous winter, and so the heavy work of that season had fallen to Dustin in ways the neighbors had noticed, but not spoken about aloud, because they were also practical people. And silence was sometimes a form of courtesy. When the fever came in late summer and took him quickly, the silence shifted in character. It became a different thing. It became the kind of silence that watches to see what a woman will do when she is alone. Dustin knew what she would do. She had known since the autumn of 1882, when she was newly married and had spent 3 weeks at the trapping cabin of Remy Pickett, Clarence's father, learning to put up provisions against a Dakota winter that arrived 6 weeks earlier than anyone expected. Remy was a man of 72 at that point, born in Quebec, trained in the northern fur trade, and possessed of a knowledge so specific and so particular to cold that it had never quite fit into the common conversation of a homestead community. He did not volunteer it. He shared it the way a careful person shares anything valuable, which is to say only when someone was listening with their whole body and not just their ears. Dustin had listened that way, what Remy understood, and what he had learned from men who had wintered in places where the thermometer could not measure the cold because the mercury froze solid, was this: snow is not cold. Snow is air, held still. Packed against a wall, it forms a layer between the living warmth inside and the killing cold outside, and the wall beneath that layer stays 15, sometimes 20 degrees warmer than a bare wall in the same wind. He had demonstrated it to her with 2 tin cups of water, one set against a bare plank outside his cabin, and one set against a plank with a packed snowbank against it. And in the morning the bare plank cup was frozen through to the bottom, and the banked cup was only skimmed with ice at the surface. He showed her the sketch he kept, a folded piece of brown paper with angles drawn on it in pencil, showing how a snow wall needed to be compacted at the base and stepped back toward the top to shed melt and prevent collapse. He had learned that from a Cree trapper named Alexis, he said, and Alexis had learned it from his father. And that was the way of useful knowledge. It traveled through people the way water travels through ground, finding its way to where it was needed. Clarence had not been much interested in the sketch. Clarence was a capable man in the ways that mattered most on a homestead, good with a plow and a fence post and a weather eye. But he had a particular quality common to capable people, which is that his own competence made other people's knowledge feel like a pleasantry rather than a necessity. He had been kind about it. He just had not been curious. When Remy died in the winter of 1885, he left Dustin the folded sketch and nothing else in writing. He left Clarence the trapping gear, the cabin, and a small amount of cash that did not survive the subsequent 2 years of dry summers. The sketch went into the cedar box under Dustin's side of the bed, and it stayed there. And she thought about it sometimes. And in the autumn of 1887, when she was alone for the first time, and the nights were beginning to hold their cold in a way that felt different from the year before, she took it out. She unfolded it on the kitchen table and smoothed it flat with the heel of her hand. The pencil lines were faded but legible. The angles were precise. Remy had written small notes beside each measurement in a cramped French-inflected hand, and she had read them enough times that she knew them without squinting. She looked at the sketch for a long time, and then she looked at her walls, and she thought about the winter that was coming, and she went to the barn to bring Nettle in close and begin. She started stacking in the first week of October, when the first real snow came, and settled without melting. She worked from the north wall first, because the north and northwest winds were the killing direction on the high plains, and she worked methodically, throwing snow against the base of the wall and compacting it with the flat side of a grain shovel, building it up in the stepped-back angle that Remy's sketch prescribed. She worked through the mornings before the sun rose high enough to soften anything, and she packed the layers tight enough that the surface dimpled when she pressed it with her thumb, but did not give way. She did this every day as new snow came, building the bank higher and wider, working around the north and west walls first, and then the east, and by the middle of October the homestead had acquired a peculiar appearance, as though the house were slowly settling into the earth and throwing up white shoulders on 3 sides. Nettle watched from the fence rail with the particular patient attention of a mule who has long since decided that human activity, however strange, is unlikely to require a response. Harlan Voss saw it on the 12th of October. He was coming back from the Alderman claim with a wagon of late-harvested grain, and he pulled up on the road where it bent near enough to Dustin's fence to give him a clear view of the walls. He sat in the wagon for a moment, and then he drove into town and went directly to the store porch, where 3 or 4 men sat most afternoons in that last hour before the cold drove everyone inside. He told them what he had seen with a dry amusement that was more cutting than laughter, because it was so casual, so unhurried, so entirely certain of its own reasonableness. The widow Weston, he said, using Clarence's surname because that was the custom, was burying her house in snow. He described the walls and the packed banks and the stepped angle and the thoroughness of the enterprise. He said it the way a man describes something he has understood completely and found wanting in one easy examination. The men on the porch received this with the particular pleasure that small communities take in news that confirms something they had already felt but not yet articulated, which was that Dustin was managing poorly, that a woman alone in her first autumn of widowhood could not be expected to think clearly, and that someone ought to speak to her about it before she did something she could not undo. Nobody went to speak to her. That kind of errand requires volunteering, and none of them volunteered. What they did instead was give the thing a name. Harlan called it her snow burial, and the name stuck with the easy permanence of names that capture something real about the way a community sees a person, even when what they see is incomplete. The snow burial. She is out doing her snow burial. Have you seen the snow burial over at the Weston place? Coralie Marsh heard the name at the store on a Thursday in late October when she had come in for flour and salt and had found 4 men, including Harlan, engaged in a leisurely review of the situation. Coralie was 24, newly married to a man named Elliot Marsh, who had a gift for writing and served as a correspondent for the County Agricultural Society. And she had a quality that some people read as boldness and others read as poor judgment, which was that she said what she thought in public. She said that she had visited Dustin that week and that the snowpacking looked deliberate and methodical to her, and that she had heard of the practice being used farther north, and she did not see the grounds for ridicule. Harlan listened to this with the patient expression of a man who finds opposition more entertaining than silence. He said that Coralie was kind to defend her neighbor, and that Dustin Weston owed his store $11.40, and that a woman who could not settle her account perhaps ought to spend her time on activities more directly related to that problem. One of the other men on the porch made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a cough, and the subject moved on, and Coralie bought her flour and her salt and left without saying anything more, because there was nothing more to say to a man who had already decided. She went to Dustin's that afternoon instead. Dustin was on the north wall when Coralie arrived, working the snow in the low light of a November afternoon, her breath making shapes in the cold air. Nettle standing at the fence rail with her ears tracking the approaching wagon. Coralie sat in her wagon for a moment and watched, and what she saw was not the disorder or grief or poor judgment that the store porch had described. What she saw was a woman working from a plan. She said so. She climbed down from the wagon and walked to where Dustin was compacting a new layer. And she said, "You know what you are doing?" Dustin said, "I am doing what my husband's father showed me." That was the whole of it. They went inside afterward, and Coralie held the sketch while Dustin put water on to boil, and Coralie read the notes in Remy's cramped hand and asked 2 precise questions about the angle of the upper step, and Dustin answered them precisely. And there was between them, after that, a kind of alliance that had nothing to do with sentiment and everything to do with 2 people who had looked at the same evidence and arrived at the same conclusion. November passed the way November does on the high plains, which is to say it pulled the warmth out of everything slowly and without ceremony, replacing it with a flat gray sky and a wind that came from the northwest without interruption. Dustin worked through it. She finished the north, west, and east walls. She left the south wall mostly clear for the winter light. She worked the snow into the base of the barn walls, too, lower and less complete than the house, but enough to reduce the wind's reach at ground level where Nettle stood. She consulted the sketch as she worked, smoothing it flat on the kitchen table at the end of each day and checking her proportions, tracing Remy's pencil lines with one finger, and she thought about him with a fondness that was not grief exactly, but was close to it, the kind of feeling you have for someone who gave you the one right thing at the one right time. The porch crowd revisited the snow burial periodically through November with diminishing interest, because the cold had not yet done anything to prove them right, and novelty requires a certain freshness to maintain its amusement. Harlan mentioned it twice more in the second week of November, once with a shake of his head that was more pitying than contemptuous, and once with a comment about how it would all melt off in a January thaw and make a fine mud wallow. Both times there were men present who nodded in the easy way of men who have not yet been asked to change their minds about anything. December came and the cold settled in properly, not yet savage but serious, the kind of cold that makes the joints in your hands ache by mid-morning. Dustin split wood, canned the last of her root vegetables, went over her supply numbers with the same care she gave the sketch, and calculated that she had enough to last through February without a trip to Voss's store. This was a thing she had specifically arranged for. She did not want to need anything from that store for the foreseeable future, and she had planned her autumn accordingly. The temperature dropped steadily through the last week of December. On the 29th, a neighbor named Caldwell came by to say his milk cow had died overnight, and he was concerned about his draft horses. On the 31st, the wind picked up from the northwest and did not stop. On January the 2nd, Dustin looked at the sky in the late afternoon and felt something in the quality of the light and the silence that was different from anything the previous months had offered, a stretched, brittle quality, as if the air itself were considering something it had not yet done. She brought in 4 days of extra wood that evening. She checked every gap in the barn wall. She fed Nettle twice and left extra bedding in the stall. She heated stones on the cook stove and wrapped them in flannel and placed them along the base of the north interior wall, not because it was necessary, but because Remy had told her once that warmth is like courage. You put it where it might be needed before you need it, not after. At 3 in the morning on January the 3rd, the temperature fell through the floor. The thermometer read 42 below when she checked it at first light, and it read 42 below at noon, and it read 41 below at 4 in the afternoon, which was not an improvement in any practical sense. The wind had not stopped. The sky was the flat white of a wall with nothing behind it. She kept the cook stove burning and the fireplace banked, and she checked on Nettle 3 times that first day, each time pressing through the door into the barn's sheltered cold, which was cold in the way a root cellar is cold, contained and bearable, the snow-banked walls having cut the wind's reach to almost nothing. Nettle stood with her eyes half closed and her breath making a slow, steady fog in the low light, and Dustin ran a hand along her neck each time and said nothing because there was nothing to say, and Nettle's ear swiveled toward her voice anyway. On the morning of January the 4th, Coralie Marsh arrived with her infant son, whose name was Henry, bundled so thoroughly that he was essentially invisible inside his wrappings. She came because Elliot had gone to help the Caldwell family, whose eldest daughter had been found frostbitten on a quarter-mile walk between the main house and the neighbor's barn the previous afternoon, and Coralie did not trust the warming capability of her own walls, which were unbanked and faced the northwest wind full on. Dustin had the door open before Coralie finished climbing down from the wagon. She took the bundled Henry from Coralie's arms and carried him inside without ceremony, and Coralie unhitched the horse and put her in the barn with Nettle, and when she came inside and pulled the door closed, she stood for a moment in the warmth of Dustin's kitchen and made a sound that was not quite a word and not quite a cry, but was the sound a person makes when something they had been afraid of. Turns out not to have happened. The house held at 53 degrees through the first night, which Dustin measured by a small thermometer she kept on the kitchen shelf. Outside, it was 42 below. The difference between inside and outside wasn't produced by the cook stove alone, which ran moderate because she was managing her wood supply carefully. The difference was in the walls. The snow had done its work. On the morning of January the 5th, Coralie woke to Henry crying and Dustin already at the stove, and she said, "How does it feel so warm in here?" And Dustin said, "It feels warm because it is warm." And Coralie said, "I know that. I mean how?" And Dustin carried her to the north wall and pressed Coralie's palm against the plaster, the way she herself had tested it on the first morning, and the plaster was cool. Not cold. Cool. Coralie understood then in the way you understand something when you feel it with your hand, rather than hear it with your ears. The news of the cold's severity came in pieces over the next 2 days, carried by whoever had been hardy or foolish enough to move between homesteads. The Caldwell family's two youngest children, who had been found in the unheated back room of their house on the night of January the 4th, did not survive. They were 3 and 6 years old. Dustin heard this from a man named Pruitt, who came to the door on the afternoon of January the 6th, his face so frostmarked that she almost did not recognize him, and she brought him inside and fed him and let him sit by the fire until he stopped shaking. And then he told her about the Caldwell children, and she sat very still for a moment with her hands in her lap, and Coralie, who was nursing Henry in the corner, was also very still. 2 families had lost all their livestock east of the creek road. The alderman claim had a burst pipe that had frozen their water supply on day 1. 3 families that Pruitt knew of had gone to the church for warmth, which was being heated by a cast-iron stove that one of the deacons had hauled in by sled. And the church was crowded and cold, but not deadly. And there were 7 people sheltering there, including the deacon's wife, who had come with her 2 older children and a very small dog that everyone was pretending not to notice. On the morning of January the 7th, which was day 4 of the hard cold, Harlan Voss came to Dustin's door. He came on foot, which told her something about the state of his horses. He was wearing 2 coats and a blanket tied over them, and his ears were wrapped in flannel. And when she opened the door and saw him standing in the gray morning light, his face was the face of a man who has been rearranging his understanding of the world for several days in the cold, and has not finished, but has decided to stop pretending he has not started. He said, "Can I come in?" She stepped back from the door and let him. He stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at Coralie and Henry and the room, which was warm, visibly and physically warm, in a way that his own house at that point was not. And he did not say anything for a long moment. He put his hands near the stove without touching it, and stood there. And Dustin poured coffee from the pot and set it on the table, and he sat down. Coralie said nothing. She had a quality of watchful quiet that operated like a form of attention, and she was attending. Harlan looked at his coffee. He looked at the wall. He looked at Dustin. He said, Remy Pickett knew what he was doing. That was all he said. He did not say that he had been wrong, because some men carry a pride that cannot survive that sentence intact. And Dustin understood this and had no particular investment in the sentence being said. What he had said was enough. It named the source. It acknowledged the knowledge. It put Remy's name in the room where it belonged. Dustin said he did. She let Harlan sit until he was warm and steady, and she fed him from the pot she'd kept on the stove, salt pork and dried corn in a thick broth that she had been stretching across 3 days. And she did not say anything about the store account or the snow burial or the months of the porch. And he did not raise those subjects either. They sat in the warmth of a room that had been built against the cold by a woman working alone from a dead man's sketch, and outside the temperature held at 40 below. And neither of them felt the need to explain what that meant. She took in a second family, the Pruitt household, on the afternoon of that same day. That was a wife named Marta, 2 older daughters, and a boy of 9 whose name was Theodore, who spent most of the next 2 days watching Nettle through the barn door with an intensity of interest that Dustin found comforting. 7 people in a 160-acre homestead house, plus an infant and a mule, and the walls held. The cook stove ran steady. The wood supply she had calculated in December proved almost exactly right, with 2 days to spare. The temperature began to lift on January the 11th. It came up slowly, degrees at a time, like something cautious. By the 12th, it was 15 below, which on the scale of that winter felt like a reprieve so generous as to seem impractical. By the 14th, it was above 0, and the snow on the south-facing slope had a quality of softness that the land had not shown in nearly 2 weeks. People began to move between homesteads again, carefully, taking stock of what the 9 days had cost. The costs were not small. The Caldwell children were gone. 2 families east of the Creek Road were left with no working livestock and would need to be resupplied before planting season or leave their claims. 6 homesteads had lost their water supply to burst pipes or frozen cisterns. The Alderman family was considering whether to stay or go, and in the end they went, pulling east before the spring mud, and that claim sat empty for a year before a new family took it. Dustin's walls had not failed. The temperature inside her house had dropped to 48 degrees on the coldest night of the freeze, which was the night of January the 7th, and it had held there until the stove brought it back, and no one inside had suffered frostbite or illness beyond the ordinary fatigue of close quarters and sustained dread. Nettle was thin but sound. The barn walls had worked, less completely than the house, but enough. When Harlan left on the morning of January the 12th, he paused at the door and said, "Your account is settled." And Dustin nodded, and that was the transaction. $11.40 of debt, forgiven without ceremony by a man who understood the arithmetic of what he owed, without being able to say it in those terms. She did not thank him for it. She did not need to. The thing was done, and they both understood what it meant and what it did not mean, and that was sufficient. In the first weeks of March, when the ground was still frozen in the shade but soft in the sun, and the light had lengthened enough to feel like a promise rather than a tease, Dustin held what she called, to herself, a working conversation. Not a lecture, not a presentation. She invited 6 homestead families to come to her place on a Saturday morning, and she walked them around the outside of her walls and showed them the snow still banked on the north and west sides, compacted and dense and still functional, though the worst was past. And she showed them the angle of the step top and the width of the base, and the logic of the north wall being built first and highest. She brought out Remy's sketch and passed it among them. Some of them held it with the careful hands of people holding something borrowed and valuable, and some of them held it at arm's length as though the pencil lines would shift if examined too closely. And Coralie's husband Elliot held it longest, tracing the French-inflected notes with one finger, asking about the Cree trapper named Alexis and how far north he had worked. Dustin answered every question plainly. She did not explain the preceding months or the store account or the name the porch had given to her work. She explained the principle. Snow traps, air. Air resists cold. A step bank compacted tight does not drift or collapse under its own weight. She explained the timing. The first good packing snow in October is the right time to begin, because the angle has to be built in layers as new snow comes, not assembled all at once. She explained the barn application and its limits. She answered the questions that arose from other questions. And when the questions stopped, she made coffee and brought it out in the cold morning air. And they stood around the walls she had built and drank it. Harlan was there. He stood at the back of the small group and listened with his arms crossed and his face held in the specific expression of a man learning something from someone he had underestimated, which is a particular kind of attentiveness that requires the whole face, not just the eyes. He did not ask questions. He took everything in. He was the third of the 6 families to bank his walls the following October. Dustin heard this from Coralie, who had heard it from Elliot, who had seen it from the road. Elliot Marsh wrote up the method that spring in a letter to the County Agricultural Society, which circulated a newsletter to homestead correspondents across the territory 4 times a year. His letter described the practice in plain, practical terms, attributed it correctly to the trapper Remy Pickett of the northern fur trade and the Cree knowledge that had informed his understanding, and noted that the method had been applied to one homestead in the vicinity of Greele, Montana, during the severe cold snap of January 1888 and had produced measurable results in interior temperature retention over a 9-day period at temperatures reaching 42 below zero. The letter ran in the spring 1888 issue and was copied in part in 2 other territorial publications that year. The Society received 8 letters of inquiry in response, which was more than they typically received about any single piece. The method did not spread quickly. Useful knowledge rarely does, because it competes with the knowledge people already have, and the people who already know something are not wrong about everything, only about this one thing. And that distinction is difficult to hold on to when someone is asking you to change a habit. It spread the way Remy had said it spread when he was alive, the way water moves through ground, finding the low places first. The families who had lost livestock or pipes in the 1888 freeze and were newly willing to consider alternatives. By 1892, there were 11 homesteads in the Greele vicinity, banking their north and west walls as a matter of autumn routine. By 1895, it was common enough that a newcomer arriving in September might observe it on 3 or 4 properties along the road into town, without knowing what to make of it. In the autumn of 1901, the County Agricultural Society published a circular on winter preparation practices for High Plains homesteads, assembled by a new corresponding secretary who had been compiling practical methods from the previous 20 years of their newsletter. The circular included a section on snow insulation with a note attributing the documented regional practice to Remy Pickett, described as a Quebec-born fur trapper and Northern Plains survivalist, and to a homestead application first recorded in 1888. Coralie's name appeared in the citation as the documenting correspondent. It was the first time any of the knowledge had a formal name attached to it, and that name was the right one. Dustin had left the Greele homestead in the spring of 1896, not under compulsion but because the land had served its purpose, and the terms of a widow's life on a High Plains claim are not indefinitely sustainable alone. And she had a sister in Billings who had asked her to come, and whose children needed a steady hand. She sold the 160 acres to a young couple from Minnesota who had come west with more hope than equipment, and she spent 2 days walking them through the property and the methods and the angles. And she left Remy's sketch with them because it belonged to the land now and not to her, though she had it copied first onto a fresh piece of paper in her own hand, her own notes beside his angles, and that copy went into her cedar box. Nettle went with her to Billings. A mule of Nettle's temperament does not belong to land either. She lived 7 more years, which is a respectable end to a long working life, and she spent those years in a small paddock behind Dustin's sister's house, where the grass came in well every spring, and there was a good overhang on the south side of the paddock wall. In the spring of 1901, a neighbor's boy brought Dustin the county circular that had just come from the Agricultural Society, because someone at the society had sent a copy addressed to her in care of her sister's house, and she was listed in the circular's notes as the homesteader who had first applied the method in documented form in the Greele vicinity. She sat at her sister's kitchen table and read it through twice, and she found Remy's name in the attribution and Coralie's name in the citation and her own name in the notes section, and she smoothed the paper flat on the table the way she had smoothed the sketch years ago. Her sister asked what it was, and she said, a record of something that worked. The circular went into her cedar box with the copy of the sketch. They are in there together, the penciled angles in the old man's hand and the printed words of a county society that had eventually arrived at the same conclusion by a longer route. The box sat on a shelf above the window in Dustin's room until the end of her life, and the light came through the window in the afternoon and touched the edge of it every day. And outside, year after year, the winters came down from the northwest with all their weight and all their cold, and the people of that territory, a few more each year, knew how to set their walls against it. The knowledge had outlived the man who carried it north from Quebec. It had outlived the woman who carried it out of a cedar box and into the walls of a homestead in October 1887, working alone in the cold morning air while a gray mule watched from the fence rail and a porch of confident men named her Work of Folly. It had outlived the Folly's name. It had found its way into the printed record and from there into the hands and habits of people who would never know Remy Pickett's name, or Dustin Weston's, or the particular quality of silence that falls on the Montana high plains when the temperature drops to 42 below and the walls hold and the cold finds nothing to take. Out behind Dustin's sister's house, in the years after Nettle was gone, a patch of frost heave lifted one corner of the paddock fence post every winter and settled it back in the spring, and no one fixed it because it always settled true. The grass came in thick around the base of the post each year, and the overhang threw a shadow across the south paddock wall at midday. And in late October, the first real snow collected in the angle between the wall and the ground, packed by the wind into a tight white hem against the stone. The way it settles when there is something solid to hold it. The way it had always settled in the right place, against the right wall.